Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. Two classmates did not simply want to take a life. They wanted, in their own words, to outdo the killers who had come before them. And they filmed themselves making the promise, on a tape they expected no one else would ever see. In September of 2006, in Pocatello, Idaho, a girl was killed while house-sitting at a relative's home on a quiet residential street. She was a classmate of the two students who killed her, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, both juniors at the local high school. The plan was cold and deliberate. The pair came to the house where the girl was looking after the property for relatives and spent part of the evening there with her and her boyfriend, watching a film together. Then they left, claiming they were heading to a movie of their own. Before they went, they had quietly unlocked a door and cut the power. Later, in the dark, they came back to a house that could not see them coming. What set this case apart was that the killers documented it themselves. Before and after the crime, they recorded video on tape, footage that police later recovered. On that recording, they spoke about sticking to the plan and about the girl having been chosen for it. They compared themselves to infamous killers of the past, boasting that those names were amateurs next to what they meant to become. And they spoke openly about making history. Few crimes ever leave behind a record of intent quite like the one these two made of themselves, narrating their own plan in real time and treating it like a performance. Investigators also found a list. The boys had begun what amounted to a roll of roughly a dozen names, other students they had marked, and prosecutors said their larger goal was a school attack in the mold of Columbine, with this killing meant as a kind of rehearsal for something far bigger and deadlier. The girl who died had been, in their minds, only the beginning. Could there be a clearer sign of planning than a list of targets started the very day of the crime? Their alibi collapsed quickly. They claimed to have been at a movie, yet when pressed, they could not describe what they had supposedly seen. Then came the recovered video. In their own voices and faces, it erased any doubt about who was responsible and how long they had prepared. What use is an alibi when the truth has already been filmed? Both were tried as adults in separate trials held in the spring and summer of 2007, and both were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Each received a fixed term of life without the possibility of parole for the murder, with decades more added for the conspiracy. So who were they? Draper had described himself as an outsider, drawn to the Columbine massacre. Adamczyk was said to be fixated on a popular horror film about a masked killer, and the prosecution framed the crime as a thrill kill rooted in that fascination. Though how much any film truly shaped them remains debated. What unsettled people most was not a sudden loss of control, but the opposite. The calm and rehearsed quality of it. They had cast themselves as the next great names in murder, and they had chosen a person they knew, treating a real life as raw material for a fantasy of fame. They wanted to be studied, talked about, feared. Instead, they became a warning. Two students who mistook cruelty for greatness and were undone by their own camera. Both remain in Idaho prisons, now in their 30s, held separately at different facilities. Idaho's highest court upheld the life without parole sentence, rejecting arguments that such a penalty was unconstitutional for someone so young, and their appeals have repeatedly failed in the years since. Each man has at times pointed to the other as the true driving force, but the tape showed them planning it together. The victim's mother spent years carrying the weight of the loss before her own death from illness. 20 years on, the case still draws attention, including a recent streaming series that revisited the killing in detail and brought both men and the girl they killed back into public view. The next case moved from a planned ambush to a morning that began at home and ended inside a school. Luke Woodham. On the 1st of October, 1997, in Pearl, Mississippi, a student named Luke Woodham killed his mother, Mary Ann Woodham, 50, at the family home. He then drove to his high school with a rifle hidden beneath a long coat and opened fire. killing 2 students and wounding several others before he was stopped. The attack ended in the parking lot, where an assistant principal named Joel Myrick had run to his own truck, retrieved a handgun, and confronted Woodham as he tried to drive away, holding him until police arrived. Woodham had left a trail that pointed to planning rather than a sudden break. Before the shooting, he handed a friend a set of notebooks that included a written statement of intent, a kind of manifesto in which he insisted he was not insane but angry. The pages laid out grievance and purpose, and they would later sit at the center of the case. This was not, prosecutors argued, the work of a moment. Investigators learned that Woodham had been linked to a small group of teenagers, known among themselves by a private name, and said to be led by an older youth, that had reportedly talked about terrorizing the school and seizing a kind of power through fear. Woodham would testify that this older friend had pushed him toward violence, including the killing of his own mother, and had spoken of bringing about a reign of terror. How much of that was true influence, and how much was a search for someone else to share the blame, became one of the trial's hardest questions. In the end, the conspiracy charges against most of the group did not hold, and the youth Woodham named received a far lighter outcome. The assistant principal had ended the attack within minutes, and Woodham was taken into custody at the scene. His own notebooks and statements became powerful evidence of intent. The defense argued that he had been insane or under a darker influence, but jurors rejected that case not once but twice, across 2 separate trials. He was convicted in 1998, first for his mother's killing and then for the school attack. He received 2 life sentences for the murders, along with lengthy additional terms for the assaults, a combination that amounted to far more than any single lifetime. Who was he behind the headlines? Woodham had been an overweight, bullied teenager who felt like an outsider, and who reached for grand and bitter ideas, even quoting philosophy, to dress up his anger and lend it a sense of purpose it never truly had. Prosecutors described someone who had nursed resentment until it hardened into a plan, then looked for a philosophy and a circle of friends to lend it shape and justify it to himself. What separated this case from an ordinary tragedy was the deliberateness of it. The notebooks, the manifesto, the talk of a wider plot, all of it suggested a young man who had thought through what he intended to do long before the morning he did it, then armed himself and drove to the place he had chosen. Was the older friend truly the architect of all this, or simply a convenient name to hand the court? The group he had fallen in with lent the case an air of conspiracy, but in the end, it was Woodham alone who carried the weapon through the school doors and used it, leaving a community to wonder how a quiet teenager had become the author of so much harm. He remains in the Mississippi prison system. He has been reported as eligible for parole only decades from now, when he would be an old man, and an earlier request for clemency from the state's governor was turned down without success. The school he attacked became, for a time, one of the names that defined a grim era of campus violence in the country. For the families of those he killed, the case settled long ago into a permanent absence that no verdict could fill. He has remained, in the years since, a fixture of the state's prison system rather than a free man. The next case crossed the ocean to a quiet town in Wales, and a plan disguised as a date. Joshua Davies. A boy talked about killing his girlfriend for months. Then he treated the day he finally did it like a wager to be settled, and walked away, as if nothing had happened. In October of 2010, near Aberconfig in South Wales, a girl named Rebecca Aylward was lured to Woodland by her former boyfriend, Joshua Davies, on the promise that they might rekindle the relationship she thought she had lost. She had even bought new clothes for the meeting, believing she was going to win him back. The reconciliation was a lie, built only to get her somewhere quiet and alone. There, Davies killed her, and her body was found 2 days later in the trees outside the village, where she had been left after agreeing to meet the boy she once trusted. For months beforehand, Davies had spoken about wanting her dead, even floating different methods to friends, including the idea of poisoning her with plant toxins. To some, it sounded like dark bravado from a teenager who liked to shock. The evidence suggested it was something closer to rehearsal. The case would become known for one grim detail. A friend had joked that he would buy Davies breakfast if he actually went through with it. On the morning of the killing, Davies had breakfast with that friend and remarked that the time had come. Afterward, he messaged that he might be owed his breakfast now, and he turned to social media to try to build himself an alibi for the hours that mattered. The casual cruelty of those messages, set beside the testimony of friends who had heard him talk about killing for months, turned the picture from a possible accident into something coldly intended. Investigators traced the long runway of talk that had led up to the act. Friends recalled the threats, the methods, the dark jokes, and the words he had spoken so freely became the spine of the case against him. Schoolmates took the stand to repeat what they had heard. The social media trail showed his attempts to look innocent in the hours afterward. Together, the long history of talk and the clumsy cover-up painted a portrait the jury could not ignore. How many people had heard him plan it without ever believing he meant it? At trial, held at Swansea Crown Court, the planning was laid bare. The judge described Davies as devious, calculating, and controlling, and said he had shown no remorse. In the summer of 2011, he was convicted of murder, and that autumn he was sentenced to detention for life, with a minimum term of 14 years to serve before he could even be considered for release, for a crime rooted in months of talk. The sentence reflected how thoroughly the court believed it had been planned. He maintained his innocence throughout, trying to push the blame onto a friend rather than accept what the long trail of evidence showed. The jury did not believe him. What kind of teenager plans a killing as if it were a dare? Davies had hidden his intentions behind the ordinary surface of a school friendship, joking about murder until the line between talk and action seemed to vanish. Those who knew Rebecca were left to absorb a painful truth, that the danger had been spoken aloud, again and again, long before anyone understood it was real. The breakfast remark, meant as a private joke, came to stand for the chilling lightness with which he had approached the whole thing. He had not been driven by sudden fury. He had decided, over weeks, that a girl who trusted him should die. And then he had kept the appointment. Davies has now served the years of his minimum term, and a parole hearing was reportedly scheduled. No release has been confirmed in any public account located, and he is understood to remain in custody under his life license, more than a decade after the killing. Rebecca's mother has campaigned openly against any decision to set him free, keeping her daughter's name in front of the public so the case would not quietly fade. She has spoken of her anger at the prospect of his release and gathered support from others who believe a life taken so deliberately should mean a lifetime served. The next case unfolded not in secret, but in front of a classroom of witnesses. Will Cornick. In April of 2014, at a Catholic school in the Halton Moor area of Leeds, England, a student named Will Cornick attacked his Spanish teacher, Anne Maguire, 61, during a class. He attacked her with a knife, and she died of her injuries. Maguire had taught at the school for 40 years and was only months from retirement, a fixture in the lives of generations of students. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of teacher a school is built around. The warning signs had not been hidden. Cornick had told classmates he intended to kill Maguire. He had even posted online, offering £10 to anyone who would do it for him. He later admitted to doctors that he had planned the attack and had meant to carry it out several days earlier, only to hold off. He brought whiskey to school that day, he said, to celebrate afterward. And he told psychiatrists he had intended to kill other teachers as well, describing his plan in the language of a multiple killing, as though more than one teacher had been marked. He spoke of celebration, not regret, about what he meant to do. The threats were not whispered. They were said out loud, to people his own age, in the days and weeks before he acted. Some classmates thought he was joking. None imagined he would walk into a lesson and do exactly what he had described. Because Cornick admitted the killing, the facts were not seriously in dispute. What the case exposed instead was a chain of missed chances. A later inquest returned a finding of unlawful killing and concluded that opportunities to prevent the attack had been lost, including warnings from his peers that were never passed along to staff. Could threats made so openly have been stopped if a single person had spoken up in time? The question haunted the school and the city long after the verdict. The inquest heard that he had been seen with a knife and had spoken of his plans. Yet that information never reached the adults who might have acted on it. It was a portrait not only of a killer, but of warnings that slipped through every gap. Cornick pleaded guilty and, in November of 2014, was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 20 years. He challenged the length of that term at the Court of Appeal and lost, the judges declining to reduce a sentence imposed for so deliberate a crime. Who was he? Friends and family described a young man whose personality had shifted and who had grown bitter, including over news that a recent diabetes diagnosis would block the Army career he had set his heart on. Those who knew him pointed to that disappointment as the moment something curdled, though nothing about it explained the calm with which he later planned a killing. He carried what was described as a deep-seated grudge against his teacher, one that had been building for some time. Most chilling was his lack of remorse afterward, a flatness that suggested he had made his peace with the act long before he committed it. He had not snapped in a single moment of rage. He had decided, told people, brought the means to school, and waited for the lesson to begin. Afterward, by several accounts, he showed no regret at all. The teacher he targeted had given 4 decades to that school, a detail that made the calculation behind the attack all the harder to absorb. He is serving his sentence in the adult prison system, having been moved between institutions for his own safety, with his minimum term not due to expire until the next decade. McGuire's family and colleagues have continued to honor a career that long outweighed the act that ended it. Remembering a teacher who had shaped the school for 2 generations, her death also forced hard questions about how schools respond when a pupil voices a threat out loud. The next case returned to a family home and a plan that had first been written down as a story. Daniel Bartlam. In April of 2011, in the Red Hill area of Nottingham, England, a student named Daniel Bartlam killed his mother, Jacqueline Bartlam, 47, as she slept, striking her with a hammer. He then tried to destroy the evidence, padding the scene with newspaper, dousing it with petrol, and setting the house on fire before escaping with his younger brother and the family dog. At first, he told police that an intruder had broken in and was responsible for everything, casting himself as a frightened boy who had fled a stranger's attack with his younger brother. That story did not survive a look at his computer. On it, investigators found a piece of fiction he had written, in which a character bearing his own name killed his mother in almost exactly the way Jacqueline had died. Police concluded the killing had been planned over several weeks, not committed in a sudden rage. The story he wrote, the clips he saved, and the fire he set all pointed the same way, toward a boy who had decided on an outcome and worked toward it. The fire and the tale of an intruder had been staged to make the scene look like anything other than what it was. He had not only imagined the crime, he had drafted it, scene by scene, with himself as the character who walks free. When detectives matched the fiction to the facts, the story of an intruder fell apart completely. Bartlam had been fixated on a television villain, a soap opera character who killed a woman with a hammer. And clips of that storyline sat on his computer, earning him a nickname in the press. He had also stocked up on violent horror films and had told a counselor that he was hearing voices. Each of these threads drew headlines, and the press fixed on the soap opera link in particular. But the courts were careful with such claims. And it was his own writing, not any television show, that ultimately condemned him. Blaming a storyline was easier than facing what he had set down himself. Investigators did not have to guess at his intentions, because he had set them down on the page in his own hand. He pleaded not guilty, arguing that he had lost control and was guilty only of a lesser charge. But the jury rejected that account and convicted him of murder in 2012. Satisfied that he had known exactly what he was doing when he raised the hammer and when he lit the match, the sentencing judge did not soften his words, telling him he had wanted to get away with the perfect murder. Bartlam had admitted that in his story the character got away with it, and that he had believed he could do the same in real life. He was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 16 years. Among the youngest people in the country convicted of so calculated a killing, what turns a schoolboy's imagination into a plan? Bartlam had rehearsed the crime on the page before carrying it out, then built a false story to cover it afterward. That blurring of fiction and intent was what made the case so disturbing. It was not that he had been swept up in a single, uncontrollable moment, but that he had written the ending in advance and then reached for it. Why else would the staged fire and the invented intruder follow so closely the script he had typed himself? The story on his computer read less like fantasy than like a blueprint. He had imagined getting away with it, written that ending down, and then attempted to make it real, down to the staging meant to fool whoever arrived first. Now, in his late 20s, Bartlam has moved through the prison system, and a parole panel recommended his transfer to open conditions, a step that requires sign-off at a senior level, and that drew public objection from a former partner of his mother. A full release has not been confirmed, and his progress through the system remains contested by those who knew Jacqueline, who argue that a crime this calculated should not be softened by the passage of time alone. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying these cases, take a moment to subscribe, because the stories only get stranger from here. The next case involved two classmates who planned to take a life together: Lucas Markham and Kim Edwards. On a night in April of 2016, in Spalding, Lincolnshire, Lucas Markham climbed into the home of his girlfriend, Kim Edwards, through a window she had opened for him. Together they killed Kim's mother, Elizabeth Edwards, 49, and Kim's younger sister, Katie, as they slept. The pair then stayed inside the house for more than a day, eating, bathing, and watching films, before they were finally discovered, when concern over the family led to the house being checked. The press would label them the Twilight Killers, after the films found in the aftermath. This was not a sudden act. The judge described the planning as remarkable, calling it substantial, meticulous, and repeated. Markham had walked to the house on earlier nights, but Kim had slept through the signals he gave at her window, and the plan succeeded only on a later attempt, after he had returned to the house on more than one night to try again. The motive, prosecutors said, lay in Kim's resentment of her mother and her belief that Elizabeth wanted to bring the young relationship to an end. The two had formed an intense bond, and the court heard that Kim had urged the plan forward while Markham, devoted to her, carried out the act. The judge went so far as to describe the killings as executions. What investigators found was a scene the pair had made no real effort to escape. They had not fled, not raised an alarm, not invented a passing intruder to explain it. They had simply remained, behaving for a day and a half as though the household around them had not changed. It was that calm, more than anything, that unsettled the people who later pieced the case together. Detectives found a home where ordinary life had carried on around an extraordinary crime, the two of them moving through rooms they had no intention of leaving for a day and a half. How could two young people sit so quietly inside what they had done? Both were convicted at Nottingham Crown Court, and in November of 2016, they were sentenced to life with minimum terms of 20 years each. On appeal, those minimum terms were reduced to 17.5 years apiece, the judges weighing their youth and the prospect of rehabilitation against the gravity of what they had done. They became known as among the youngest double murderers in Britain, a description that followed the case through every retelling. The Twilight name came from the films the two had watched after the killings, not from any motive the court ever established. Like several cases of its kind, the story attracted a media label that suggested a film had driven it, when the evidence pointed instead to something colder and more personal. A teenager's wish to remove the parent standing between her and the boy she wanted, and a boy willing to do it for her. The films offered a headline. The truth offered a far more ordinary and chilling motive. So who were they? Kim was described as resentful and controlling toward her own family. Markham as devoted enough to her to act on that resentment. Together, they formed the kind of closed, intense pairing that shut out everyone else. Their anonymity, granted because of their youth, was lifted by the Court of Appeal in 2017 when their sentences were reduced, allowing them to be named and pictured for the first time. The public finally saw the faces behind a case that had until then been described only in outline, a decision that itself drew debate about naming child defendants. Both remain incarcerated, now in their early 20s and held apart. Their earliest eligibility for release sits around the start of the next decade, and no such release has come. Both have grown from children into adults inside the prison system. The case still cited whenever the difficult question of very young killers returns to public debate. For the surviving members of the Edwards family, the case left a household halved in a single night by the two people who should have had the least reason to harm it. The next case crossed to California, and a killing that 3 classmates spent months planning. Royce Casey, Jacob DeLashmutt, and Joseph Fiorella. 3 classmates did not kill on impulse. They planned what they called a sacrifice for months, convinced it would give them something in return, a kind of dark power they believed a single life, taken in the right way, could buy them. In the summer of 1995, in San Luis Obispo County, California, a classmate named Elise Poller was lured to a secluded eucalyptus grove by 3 boys from her own high school, Royce Casey, Jacob DeLashmutt, and Joseph Fiorella, under a false pretext. There she was killed, and her body would not be found for many months, leaving her family in agonizing uncertainty. This was no flash of violence. The 3 had discussed the killing dozens of times across months, treating it as a ritual they believed would empower their death metal band and please a dark power they had convinced themselves was listening. They had given the act the language of a sacrifice, and spoke of it as if it were somehow owed to them. They had chosen her in advance, describing her in their own twisted terms as a fitting target for what they meant to do. The planning, more than the belief behind it, was what marked the case as something rare and deliberate. Who spends months rehearsing a killing in their own minds, debating it again and again before finally carrying it out? For a long stretch, the case went nowhere. Elise was treated as a missing person, not yet known to be dead, and the grove kept its secret for the better part of a year. The break came from one of the killers himself. Royce Casey, unable to live with what he had done, confessed first to a member of the clergy and then to police, and led investigators to the remains in the spring of the following year. Without that confession, freely given to a clergyman who urged him toward the police, the truth might have stayed buried far longer. The case became infamous well beyond the crime. When Elise's family sued the band's Slayer, arguing its lyrics had helped incite the killing and shape the minds of the boys who carried it out. Both lawsuits were dismissed by the courts. Even one of the killers later rejected the idea that the music was the cause, pointing instead to one boy's personal fixation on the victim. The notion that a band had driven the crime became a contested and ultimately rejected narrative. even as it gave the case a lasting notoriety far beyond the county where it happened. All three eventually admitted their roles, pleading to first-degree murder in the years that followed and receiving sentences of 25 or 26 years to life, with one of them given a slightly shorter minimum than the others. They had been schoolmates of the girl they killed, ordinary in the eyes of those around them, who had built a private fantasy out of a band, a belief, and a craving for power, then made it real on someone they knew. The gap between how they appeared and what they had planned was, for many, the hardest part to absorb. They were not strangers to the girl they killed, but classmates who passed her in the same halls, which made the months of cold planning all the harder to comprehend. How had three young people talked themselves, over months, into believing a killing was something to be performed and rewarded? Decades later, as the men reached middle age, the case returned to the headlines. Jacob DeLashmutt was granted parole and released in 2025, having admitted he had been the ringleader and expressed remorse for the path that had led to it. Royce Casey was also released in 2025, roughly 30 years after the killing, his earlier parole grant having first been overturned by an appeals court before his eventual release. Joseph Fiorella, the youngest of the three, remained incarcerated, with a parole hearing due the following year. That he stayed behind bars while the other two went free, despite having been the youngest of the three, drew comment about the fairness of the outcome. Elise's family did not oppose Casey's release, citing his early confession, but objected to the others walking free. The next case moved to Texas, and a son who calmly called the police on himself. Jake Evans. On a night in October of 2012, near Aledo in Parker County, Texas, a homeschooled student named Jake Evans shot and killed his mother, Jamie Evans, 48, a former teacher, and his younger sister, Mallory, inside the family home where the three of them lived. He then called emergency services and confessed in a recording that ran for roughly 20 minutes, telling the dispatcher, with unsettling flatness, that what had happened had built up over time, and that he had been thinking about killing for a while. What turned the case from a sudden tragedy into a study in cold planning was Evans's own written confession, set down in his own words. In it, he described considering one weapon before settling on a stolen revolver, choosing it, he said, so that the people he killed would feel as little as possible. He described the choice the way someone might describe a plan turned over carefully in advance. He wrote that he had paced the house for more than an hour, working up what he called the courage to act. The detachment in those pages, the careful weighing of method, was what made the confession so disturbing to read. This was not a boy who lost control. It was one who deliberated. On the call, he answered the dispatcher's question steadily, describing what he had done without panic, a composure that would sit at the heart of the case against any claim that he had not known what he was doing. Evans also told investigators that he had watched a well-known horror film several times that week and had come to identify with its silent, masked killer, a figure who takes lives without any visible feeling or remorse. As in other cases of its kind, that claim of influence came from the killer's own mouth, and prosecutors were careful to stress that he had acted with deliberation rather than under any spell a film could cast. Was the film a cause, or simply a costume he reached for to explain something even he may not have understood? The court treated it as the latter. There was little about his background that offered an easy answer. He had been homeschooled, with no public record of mistreatment and no confirmed diagnosis before the killings. Nothing in his history that pointed plainly to what he would do. After his arrest, he was found unfit to stand trial and was treated at a state hospital. His thought processes described as abnormal before he was restored to competency more than 2 years later, and the case finally moved forward. The delay meant that years passed between the killings and any resolution. In 2015, Evans pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. with the more serious capital count set aside as part of the agreement, sparing him the most severe penalty the state could impose. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of 45 years, becoming eligible for parole only after serving roughly half of that time, including the years he had already spent in custody. His extended family supported the plea, describing it as a way to close a chapter none of them could change, and to avoid the ordeal of a trial that would only deepen the loss. Who was he beneath the calm? Evans presented as quiet and unremarkable. A young man no one around him seemed to fear or even closely watch. The recorded call exposed the distance between that surface and the planning underneath. A teenager who could describe killing his own mother and sister in the same even tone he might use to report a fire. Investigators and jurors alike struggled to reconcile the ordinary boy with a voice on the call. He remains in the Texas prison system, with his earliest parole eligibility not arriving until the mid to late 2030s, decades after the night he called for help on his own crime. The surviving relatives chose to support the deal rather than relive everything at a trial. The next case crossed to Australia, to a forest already bound to one of the country's most infamous names, Matthew Millott and Cohen Klein. Some killers spend their lives trying to escape their family history. This one stepped straight into it, in the very forest that had already made his family name a byword for murder, choosing the ground deliberately. In November of 2010, in Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales, Australia, a teenager named David Ochterlony was lured into the trees by Matthew Millott, a young man he had counted as a friend and the great-nephew of the backpacker killer whose crimes, committed years earlier in those same woods, had made the forest infamous across the country. There, Millott attacked and killed him, while an older companion, Cohen Klein, recorded the scene on a mobile phone. David had walked into the forest with someone he trusted, and the killing took place on his birthday. The courts found the murder planned and premeditated, with Millott luring his friend deep into the forest, already intending to take his life. This was not a confrontation that spun out of control. It was an outing arranged around a killing, the destination chosen long before they set off. Everything about the day, the courts concluded, had been built toward that single purpose. The recording that Klein made became central evidence at trial, capturing the killer's own words and leaving the courts in no doubt about what had happened or how willingly it was done. Afterward, Millott boasted about his family name and the killer it was tied to, and spoke of the thrill of what he had done, while Klein remarked that he was following the same path as his infamous relative. The casual pride in those words struck the sentencing court as deeply chilling. That a teenager would seek to inherit a murderer's legacy rather than flee it gave the case a horror all its own. Why choose that forest, of all places, when any patch of bushland would have served? The answers seemed to lie in the name itself. Millott had grown up in the shadow of a relative whose crimes were known across the country, and rather than distance himself, he appeared to embrace the association, choosing the same ground and gloating about the connection afterward. Where most would have wanted nothing to do with such a legacy, he seemed to treat it as something to live up to. The recording removed any doubt about intent, leaving the courts with a clear picture of a planned killing carried out for the thrill of it, in a place chosen for its dark history. Both young men pleaded guilty to murder. In 2012, Millott was sentenced to a maximum of 43 years with a 30-year non-parole period. At the time, the heaviest sentence handed to a juvenile in the state's history, a measure of how gravely the court viewed the planning, the recording, and the gloating that followed. Klein, who was slightly older, received a lesser term for his role in recording the crime rather than carrying it out, though the court found he had played his part willingly and shared in the planning. On appeal, Millott's challenge was dismissed, while Klein's sentence was reduced, lowering his maximum term and bringing his parole eligibility forward to the early 2030s. Milat later lost a further bid in the country's highest court, exhausting his remaining avenues of appeal and leaving his lengthy sentence in place. So who was Matthew Milat? He was a teenager who treated a family name built on death as something to live up to rather than something to escape, and who appeared to relish the comparison. The premeditation, the deliberate choice of that location, and the boasting afterward painted a young man chasing notoriety, willing to end the life of someone who trusted him to claim a place in a grim family lineage. He did not run from the name he had been born into. He tried to earn it. Both remain incarcerated in New South Wales, far from any prospect of early release. Milat is not eligible for parole until the start of the 2040s, while Klein becomes eligible some years sooner. The case remains one of the most disturbing involving young offenders in the country's recent memory, remembered for the family name as much as for the crime itself. The next case returned to England, to a killing its perpetrator tried to disguise as something it was not. Thomas Griffiths. In May of 2019, in the town of Calne in Wiltshire, England, a student named Thomas Griffiths drove without a license to the home of his former girlfriend, Ellie Gould, the day after she ended their relationship of a few months. There, he killed her in her own home, a place where she should have been safe. Both were sixth form students at the same school in the area, where they had moved in the same circle, and it was Ellie's own father who found her body when he returned home. What set this case among the others was not a weapon brought from home, but what Griffiths did afterward. He arranged the scene to suggest that Ellie had harmed herself, even placing an object in her hand to support the illusion. So convincing was the staging at first glance that her father initially believed she had taken her own life, a cruelty layered on top of the loss itself. The court would later make clear that the murder itself was not legally premeditated, since Griffiths had not brought the weapon with him. The planning, in this case, lay not in the killing, but entirely in the elaborate cover-up that came after. And the cover-up was elaborate. After the killing, Griffiths cleaned himself up, returned to school, and went about his day. He sought sympathy from a member of staff, messaged Ellie's friends pretending he could not reach her, and explained away marks on his own neck, left as she defended herself, as signs of self-harm. He had driven himself to and from the scene without a license, then slipped back into the ordinary rhythm of a school day. He lied to police repeatedly. For a short time, the staged scene and the steady performance nearly held, and the truth came close to being lost. How close had a teenager come to passing off a killing as a private tragedy? It did not hold for long, and the unraveling was swift. The evidence at the scene and the marks that told their own story soon contradicted the picture Griffiths had tried to paint, and his account began to collapse under careful questioning. He pleaded guilty to murder, and in November of 2019, he was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 12.5 years. The sentencing judge described it as among the most appalling acts imaginable, committed against a young woman in her own home. Reporting restrictions were lifted so that he could be named. The authorities considered whether the sentence was too lenient, but the law barred the harshest tariff for someone his age, and the case could not be referred for review. The length of that minimum term became a cause in itself. Because the law barred the harshest tariff for someone his age, the case could not be referred for an increase, a limit that struck many as unjust given the violence of the act and the calculated staging that followed it. Out of that anger grew a campaign led by Ellie's mother, Carol Gould, who helped found a campaign group pressing for tougher sentencing in domestic killings and for recognition of so-called overkill, a term for violence far beyond what is needed to cause death, as an aggravating factor at sentencing. Her work contributed to real changes in how such killings are weighed by the courts, including formal recognition that extreme violence can count against a killer at sentencing, and she was later honored for the campaign. Who was Thomas Griffiths? He was an ordinary-seeming student who could not accept being left, and who answered rejection by ending a life and then lying with remarkable composure to everyone around him. What disturbed people was not rage, but control. The ease with which he moved from the scene of a killing to the schoolyard as if nothing at all had happened. He remains incarcerated, his minimum term not due to expire until the early 2030s, which means he could one day seek release, while still a relatively young man. The reforms his crime helped inspire now stand as part of what the case left behind, alongside the lasting absence of the young woman at its center. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.